In the sultry summer of 1893, in Commerce, Texas, a child was born who would one day become one of the most unorthodox, daring, and ultimately legendary figures in military aviation history. Claire Lee Chennault, the son of a Louisiana dentist, wasn't born into wealth or privilege, but he carried a fire in his soul, a rebellious energy that would drive him through turbulent skies, fierce battles, and into the heart of one of the most dramatic theaters of the Second World War. From an early age, Chennault stood out. He was headstrong, disciplined in his own way, and fascinated with flight long before he ever touched an airplane. Growing up in the Deep South during a time when aviation was still a miracle of modern science, young Claire developed a romantic fascination with the idea of air combat. But his path to becoming an air commander wasn't straightforward. After a stint at Louisiana State University, he found himself restless and searching. In 1917, when the United States entered the Great War, Chennault saw an opportunity and enlisted in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. His early years in military service were far from glamorous. He didn't get the chance to fight in World War I, and his dream of becoming a combat pilot seemed always just out of reach. Yet his persistence, and later, his understanding of air strategy, would set him apart from his peers. By the 1920s, Chennault had joined the U.S. Army Air Corps and was slowly developing a reputation as a talented instructor and tactical thinker. Unlike most of the senior brass of his time, who still believed in close formation flying and traditional dogfight tactics, Chennault was pushing for something radically different. He believed in aggressive, calculated aerial attacks. He studied air combat intensively and became one of the first proponents of what would eventually become modern fighter tactics. His views made him a controversial figure. While other officers drilled in tight formations and textbook maneuvers, Chennault drilled his pilots to improvise, to strike hard and fast, to break formation when necessary and think for themselves. He emphasized deflection shooting and taught his men to fire not just at where an enemy was, but where they would be. This approach clashed with the rigid structure of the Army Air Corps, and in 1937, after a series of conflicts with high command and health problems including partial hearing loss, Chennault retired from active U.S. service. But his story was far from over. At a time when most retired officers faded into civilian life, Chennault's next chapter would catapult him into the center of one of the world's most brutal and underreported wars, the Sino-Japanese War. That same year, he was invited by Madame Chiang Kai-shek, wife of the Chinese nationalist leader, to help modernize the Chinese Air Force. It was a war-torn, fragmented nation with outdated equipment and ill-trained pilots, facing the rising imperial power of Japan. Chennault didn't hesitate. He took the offer and flew to China. There, he saw not only the dire state of the Chinese defenses but also the brutal tactics of the Japanese air forces, bombing civilian centers with impunity, terrorizing entire cities like Shanghai and Nanjing. The Chinese pilots were overwhelmed, their aircraft inferior, and morale was near collapse. But Chennault didn't see hopelessness. He saw a challenge. Taking charge of training and strategy, he began to shape a small, elite group of pilots. He studied Japanese tactics in detail, analyzing their strengths and vulnerabilities. He found weaknesses in their formations, limitations in their range, and predictable patterns in their strikes. And with his growing network of Chinese and American contacts, he began to develop a plan, one that would turn a ragtag group of foreign volunteers into the most feared flying unit in the Far East. The Flying Tigers, as they would later be known, were born out of this vision. Officially named the American Volunteer Group, AVG, they were organized in 1941 with the backing of the U.S. government, secretly, before America had even officially entered World War II. President Roosevelt, sympathetic to China's plight and wary of Japan's aggression, allowed Chennault to recruit American military pilots willing to resign their commissions and fight under Chinese command. Chennault set up a training base in Burma, near the Chinese border, and began preparing his squadron for war. These weren't your average airmen. Many were thrill-seekers, idealists, or just looking for a good paycheck, $600 to $750 a month, plus bonuses for each Japanese plane shot down. But under Chennault's discipline and instruction, they became a cohesive unit of lethal airmen. He emphasized speed, surprise, and tactics designed to exploit Japanese weaknesses. The P-40 Warhawk, rugged, fast, and armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, became their signature aircraft. Though outmatched in maneuverability by Japan's agile Mitsubishi A6M0, Chennault drilled into his men that they could outfight the enemy through coordination, discipline, and his playbook of aggressive tactics. By December 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and brought the U.S. into the war, Chennault and his Tigers were already in action. Their first official combat occurred just days later, on December 20, 1941, when the Flying Tigers intercepted Japanese bombers en route to Kunming, China. They tore into the formation with precision, downing multiple bombers and sending a shockwave through the Japanese command. The myth of Japanese air invincibility was shattered in a single battle, and the legend of the Flying Tigers began to spread. News of their victories, exaggerated or not, captivated the American public. With shark-faced P-40s and dramatic dogfights, Chennault's squadron became a symbol of hope in those early, dark months of the Pacific War. Magazine covers, newspapers, and radio broadcasts hailed their exploits. Hollywood took notice. Propaganda campaigns featured the Tigers as the spearhead of American resistance in Asia. Behind the glory, though, was relentless hardship. The Tigers flew in brutal tropical conditions, facing mechanical failures, limited fuel, unreliable spare parts, and wave after wave of Japanese attacks. Their airstrips were crude, their rations basic, and their medical care minimal. And yet, their kill ratio climbed higher and higher. In just 7 months, the AVG was credited with shooting down nearly 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 14 pilots in air combat. But Chennault wasn't focused on the headlines. He was focused on keeping his unit alive, and on a bigger picture. He believed that air power could turn the tide of war in China and that control of the skies could be the key to breaking Japanese momentum. His tactics, though revolutionary and effective, continued to stir controversy. Many in the U.S. military establishment still saw him as a renegade, an outsider who rejected traditional doctrines. But his results were undeniable, and his methods, independent initiative, decentralized command, hit-and-run raids, would later influence the evolution of fighter operations across the Pacific and beyond. As 1942 rolled on, and the United States ramped up its military presence in the Pacific, Chennault's AVG was eventually absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces, becoming the 14th Air Force. Though the original Flying Tigers were disbanded in July 1942, their spirit lived on, and Chennault remained at the helm, now with full U.S. command and broader resources at his disposal. When the Flying Tigers officially became part of the U.S. Army Air Forces in July 1942, the world knew the name Lee Chennault. But inside the military hierarchy, he was still seen by many as an outsider, an aging, independent-minded commander with unconventional ideas and a disregard for bureaucracy. His reputation as a maverick followed him into his new role as the commander of the newly formed 14th Air Force in China. Yet for the men who flew under him, and for the Chinese people he had sworn to protect, Chennault was a hero. A leader who understood combat not from a desk, but from experience. He inspired loyalty and trust because he led with both courage and clarity. And he wasn't done fighting. With his new command, Chennault expanded operations across China. His air strategy remained focused: strike fast, keep the enemy off balance, and never engage in a fight where your advantages are neutralized. The terrain of China, its mountains, valleys, and scattered airstrips, became part of his defense. He turned geography into an ally, using remote bases and camouflage to keep the Japanese guessing. But his challenges weren't only in the sky. As the U.S. began to pour resources into the Pacific theater, most of the focus, and funding, went to the island-hopping campaigns across the South Pacific. China was seen by some in Washington as a secondary front, politically important but strategically remote. Chennault fought bitterly for resources, aircraft, fuel, and spare parts. He lobbied in Washington, clashed with senior Army leaders, and was in near-constant disagreement with General Joseph Stilwell, the top U.S. commander in the China-Burma-India theater. Chennault and Stilwell had opposite worldviews. Stilwell favored a long-term strategy of building up a Chinese ground army and striking through Burma. Chennault believed China's best hope lay in air power, crippling Japan's supply lines, bombing railroads and air bases, and keeping Japanese forces tied down far from the main Pacific front. The two men barely concealed their contempt for one another, and their feud became one of the most toxic command rivalries of the entire war. Still, Chennault persisted. With limited resources and relentless determination, he kept his fighters in the air. His men flew missions over treacherous terrain, sometimes with half-functioning aircraft and outdated maps. They battled enemy fighters, bad weather, and fuel shortages. Every mission was a risk. Every flight a test of courage. But the Flying Tigers, now part of the 14th Air Force, kept up the pressure. Chennault expanded reconnaissance missions, launched deep penetration strikes into enemy territory, and relied on a network of Chinese informants to pinpoint enemy movements. He built one of the most efficient intelligence networks in the war, aided by both Chinese resistance forces and American advisors. With their help, his fighters targeted Japanese supply trains, fuel depots, and communication hubs. They became masters of disruption. Japanese airfields became prime targets. Chennault's squadrons would strike with surprise, hit hard, and vanish before the enemy could respond. At night, Chinese saboteurs guided American planes with lantern signals. At daybreak, P-40s screamed out of the clouds to pounce on vulnerable convoys or unsuspecting bomber formations. One of Chennault's most critical achievements was the protection of the Hump, the vital airlift route over the Himalayas that connected India and China. Since the Japanese had cut off the Burma Road, flying supplies over the world's highest mountains was the only way to keep the Chinese war effort alive. It was dangerous, often deadly. But without it, the Chinese front would collapse. Chennault's fighters patrolled the skies around the Hump, warding off Japanese interceptors and clearing the path for Allied transports. His airmen risked their lives daily, and many paid the ultimate price. But because of their sacrifice, and Chennault's leadership, China remained in the fight. As the war dragged into 1943 and 1944, Chennault's position became more complicated. Though his airmen were scoring consistent victories and maintaining an impressive kill-to-loss ratio, he was once again at odds with senior command. He argued that a concentrated strategic bombing campaign in China could cripple Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia. He requested more bombers, more fighters, and more logistical support to expand operations. Washington, however, had different priorities. With victories mounting in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Midway, and the push toward the Philippines, China was losing its influence on overall war strategy. Chennault's requests were often delayed, minimized, or ignored. His frustration grew. Still, he fought on. One of the most legendary moments of Chennault's air war came during Operation Ichigo in 1944, when Japan launched a massive offensive to conquer southern China and destroy American airbases. It was one of the largest Japanese operations of the war, involving over 500,000 troops. Chennault's forces were outnumbered, under-equipped, and forced to retreat repeatedly. But they didn't give up. Chennault launched a fierce air defense campaign. His pilots attacked Japanese columns from the air, strafing roads, bridges, and supply lines. They bought time, slowed the Japanese advance, and inflicted heavy losses. Though many American and Chinese bases were lost during the operation, Chennault's airmen continued to fight from scattered forward positions, constantly relocating and striking back when least expected. Despite setbacks, the 14th Air Force under Chennault was credited with destroying thousands of Japanese vehicles, dozens of ships, and hundreds of aircraft by war's end. Their achievement stood as a testament to Chennault's tactical genius and his relentless commitment to the cause. But war also takes a personal toll. By 1945, Chennault was exhausted, physically and politically. His health had deteriorated. Years of tension, tropical illness, and deafness in one ear had left him worn. He clashed more frequently with high command and felt increasingly isolated. After years of begging for support, fighting internal battles with military bureaucracy, and enduring political maneuvering, he saw the writing on the wall. In July 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, Lee Chennault resigned from active duty. He left his post with dignity but deep frustration. He had given everything to the China theater. While other generals enjoyed promotions and honors, Chennault walked away without the recognition many believed he deserved. But for the Chinese people, and for the pilots who flew under his command, his legacy was never in doubt. He had defended the skies of China with courage, skill, and vision. He had trained an elite fighting force from nothing. He had shown that with the right strategy and unwavering determination, superior numbers could be overcome. And he had done it all with shark-faced planes, a battered flight jacket, and a vision no one else could see until it was already flying high over the Himalayas. When Lee Chennault left active duty in July 1945, it was the end of one war, but not the end of his fight. The world was celebrating victory. The Japanese Empire had surrendered. Cities erupted in joy. But for Chennault, the peace was incomplete. China, the country he had grown to love and risked everything to defend, was descending into chaos. The temporary unity between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong was collapsing fast. A civil war, long brewing beneath the surface, exploded into open conflict. And once again, Chennault refused to stand by. Though officially retired, he remained deeply involved in Chinese affairs. He had developed close personal relationships with both Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang, who regarded him as not just a military advisor but a trusted friend. They respected his strategic mind, his understanding of modern warfare, and his deep empathy for the Chinese people. Chennault had always believed that China could be a bulwark of freedom in Asia, a democratic, modern nation strong enough to resist both Japanese imperialism and communist expansion. Now, with Japan defeated, he turned his attention to the growing threat of communism, which was spreading rapidly through northern China. In 1946, he returned to China and began a new chapter, not as a military officer, but as a civilian advisor and entrepreneur. Along with a few wartime colleagues, he founded Civil Air Transport, CAT, an airline that, on the surface, was a commercial venture designed to support China's post-war recovery. But beneath the civilian logo, CAT was something else entirely, a private air force in everything but name. With surplus aircraft, experienced pilots, and a network of wartime contacts, Chennault transformed CAT into a strategic tool for the Chinese nationalists. The airline carried cargo, weapons, and supplies to remote battlefronts. It rescued wounded soldiers, flew reconnaissance missions, and even evacuated civilians trapped in communist territory. Chennault was once again flying into danger, not with a badge or uniform, but with the same determination that had once driven the Flying Tigers into the skies. While the U.S. government officially remained neutral in the Chinese Civil War, many in Washington still saw China as the next critical front in the global struggle between democracy and communism. Chennault's work, though unofficial, was quietly supported by factions within the U.S. intelligence community. And soon, his airline would become entangled in a much larger web of geopolitics. But for Chennault, it was always personal. He wasn't chasing profit or power. He genuinely believed he was helping save a nation that had become part of his soul. By the late 1940s, the tide of war had turned decisively against the nationalists. Despite U.S. aid and Chennault's efforts, Mao's communist forces gained territory with speed and confidence. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was declared in Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek and his forces retreated to the island of Taiwan. For Chennault, it was a bitter moment. His dream of a free, united China had vanished. Still, he didn't give up. Chennault relocated Civil Air Transport to Taipei, Taiwan, where it continued to operate as a lifeline for the exiled nationalist government. CAT now served as both a commercial airline and a shadow organization conducting clandestine missions throughout Asia. The Cold War was heating up, and the U.S. was beginning to invest more heavily in covert operations against communist regimes. In 1950, with the outbreak of the Korean War, Chennault's experience and contacts once again became valuable. Though he did not return to the military, his airline assisted U.S. operations in the region, ferrying supplies and providing reconnaissance. It became increasingly clear that CAT, under Chennault's leadership, was functioning as an unofficial branch of American foreign policy in Asia. Eventually, Civil Air Transport was absorbed by the CIA, which used it as the foundation for a new front company called Air America. For years to come, Chennault's legacy would fly in secret, conducting missions from Laos to Vietnam and beyond. The Flying Tigers may have ended with the war, but their spirit, tactics, and even personnel lived on in the shadow war of intelligence and influence. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Chennault's story was still largely underappreciated. Though recognized with the rank of lieutenant general upon retirement and awarded several honors, he never received the widespread fame or political support he had earned in China. He returned to the U.S. often, mostly to lobby for more support for Taiwan and stronger action against the spread of communism in Asia. He spoke before Congress, met with politicians, and warned that the fall of China was not the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. In 1953, during one of his many advocacy trips to Washington, he was finally recognized more formally when President Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed him as a special consultant to the U.S. Air Force. The appointment was largely symbolic, but it showed that even as the years passed, Chennault's insights were still valued. But time was catching up to him. Years of constant travel, poor health, and stress had taken their toll. By the mid-1950s, he was fighting a new battle, this one within his own body. In 1957, Claire Lee Chennault was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. The disease progressed quickly. But even in his final months, he remained focused on the causes he believed in. He continued to advise CAT operations, met with foreign dignitaries, and wrote his memoirs. Shortly before his death, the U.S. government awarded him a special citation for his lifetime of service. He accepted it with characteristic humility. His life had been spent in service of ideals larger than medals, loyalty, freedom, and the belief that even small forces, with the right leadership, could change the course of history. On July 27, 1958, Claire Lee Chennault died in New Orleans at the age of 64. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. For those who served under him, and for generations of Chinese and American airmen, he remained a legend. The man who had trained the Flying Tigers, defended the skies of China, and battled both enemies abroad and skeptics at home, had left behind more than just a story. He left behind a model of bold leadership, creative warfare, and unswerving dedication. And long after his final flight, the echoes of his propellers could still be heard, over the jungles of Asia, in the halls of Washington, and in the legacy of every pilot who chooses courage over conformity. Claire Lee Chennault's death in 1958 closed the final chapter on a life spent in near-constant motion, on battlefields, in briefing rooms, across continents and cultures. But the legacy he left behind did not end with his passing. In many ways, the ideas and principles he fought for took flight long after his final mission. The Flying Tigers, the group that had earned global fame under his command, were more than just a unit of wartime pilots. They represented a new kind of warfare, fierce, flexible, fast. Chennault's tactical doctrines, especially his focus on air superiority, rapid strike capability, and the role of air power in modern conflict, would influence U.S. air strategy for decades. His belief in decentralized, pilot-driven decisions foreshadowed the autonomy and responsibility later given to jet fighter squadrons during the Cold War and Vietnam. But beyond tactics and military doctrine, Chennault's story was also one of moral clarity and human connection. He had chosen to stand with a nation not his own. He had flown with pilots who followed him not because of rank, but because of respect. He believed in using force to protect the vulnerable, to challenge tyrants, and to stand in defense of people who couldn't always defend themselves. His role in China was not just military, it was humanitarian. He witnessed the devastation of war firsthand and dedicated his life to preventing it from consuming the innocent. To the people of China, particularly in Taiwan and the wartime cities he defended like Kunming and Chongqing, Chennault's name became a symbol of resistance and friendship. Statues were erected. Streets and parks were named after him. He was remembered not as a foreign soldier, but as a brother in arms who had fought side by side with them when few others would. In the United States, his image took on a more complex shape. Among military historians, he remained a controversial figure, brilliant but divisive, a rebel who often clashed with superiors. But among veterans, pilots, and those who knew the grit of combat, Chennault stood tall. His insistence on adapting to the enemy, his willingness to challenge dogma, and his refusal to abandon his mission made him a figure of respect across the armed forces. Even Hollywood continued to revisit his story. Films and documentaries kept the legend of the Flying Tigers alive. The image of the shark-mouthed P-40s diving into battle became an iconic symbol of American valor in the Pacific. Museums featured exhibits about the AVG, highlighting the daring raids, the ragtag beginnings, and the incredible odds they overcame. In the 1980s and 1990s, U.S. China historical initiatives brought renewed attention to Chennault's role, especially in Cold War diplomacy. In 2005, Chennault's former base in Guilin, China, was transformed into a museum honoring the Flying Tigers. Visitors from around the world, including surviving veterans and descendants, traveled to the site to commemorate the sacrifices made there. Even after decades of political shifts, Claire Chennault remained a bridge between the two nations, a reminder of a time when Americans and Chinese stood together against a common enemy. His family, too, continued the mission. Several of his children and grandchildren took part in efforts to preserve his legacy, both in historical preservation and public education. In Monroe, Louisiana, the Chennault Aviation and Military Museum was founded, filled with artifacts, letters, and stories from his remarkable career. Visitors walk through its halls and discover the journey of a boy from Texas who changed the skies over Asia. Perhaps most touching is the way his name continues to fly. Civil air transport may have evolved into Air America and eventually vanished into the fog of Cold War operations, but its origin, the spark of a visionary, remains tied to Chennault's bold thinking. And every pilot who trains to outthink rather than outgun the enemy owes something to his legacy. In the broader arc of history, Claire Lee Chennault may not have reached the same household name status as MacArthur, Eisenhower, or Patton. But among those who know air power, strategic innovation, and asymmetric warfare, Chennault stands as a giant. He was a man who saw clearly when others were blind to change. He embraced new ideas, trusted those beneath him, and always focused on outcomes over politics. His legacy is that of a commander who never gave up, even when his resources were few, his enemies many, and his superiors skeptical. He trusted his instincts, and more importantly, he trusted his men. He proved that air power, when applied creatively and boldly, could turn the tide of a battle, even in the most remote corners of the world. And he showed that one person, armed with vision, conviction, and courage, can help change the course of history.